Hello and welcome back to another episode of Discography Discussion, a show where we take a look at a certain artist, group, or band's studio albums. And today we've got a very special artist or group or band. Honestly, it could be all three considering the amount of band members this band goes through, but Misfits. Most famously known as the skull and logo on t-shirts of all the fashionista kids of LA. And surprisingly, yes, there is a band that ties in with them. They're not just the smiley face on the shirt. And today we're going to take a look at the very long and extensive history of these guys and, of course, the albums as well that follow with this history. And I say extensive history because they have a lot that went on. A lot of band members that came and went from as early as soon as they started. They were formed in 1997. They were named after Marilyn Monroe's last official film to come out called The Misfits, and they just decided to call themselves Misfits. After a while of painting their faces and talking about B-horror movies and from the 60s and 50s, they eventually became known as a genre called horror punk, which is actually pretty cool sounding when you think about it, but that was as early as 1977. Now, before we do move into the albums, I do have to say that they're technically chronologically out of order because one of the albums didn't come out until way later, but was recorded technically first. And I'm gonna stick with the order that the band has through their discography. And in case you're wondering, that skull, their icon and their mascot, essentially the actual character, is a thing from before even them. It came from a film serial, the kind you watch, not the kind you eat, from 1946 called The Crimson Ghost. And if you want, go ahead and look it up. They're pretty freaky images when you think about them being in the 40s, but for their band, it fits 10 times better than it did those movies. But anyway, let's move into the first album. Their first album is Walk Among Us. Technically, this one has two covers. I picked the pink one because that was the one I saw first. There's a purple one as well. A lot of these albums have alternate covers. Some of them, they're just kind of nothing or promotional things, but considering where the Misfits started early on, this is one of the ones where it's just kind of like we don't know what it really looks like. But regardless, it came out in 1982. Like I said, technically not their first recorded album, but one that came that eventually got released publicly as opposed to the one that I'm talking about later on. But regardless, came out in 1982, total 13 tracks and 24 minutes. The style of Misfits is mostly that a lot of their songs have to only last about a minute 30 seconds, maybe at the most 2, maybe even 3 minutes, but not really long. They're very fast, they're very hectic and chaotic, and they're really quick. And they all actually have some really nice tones to them. Also, I did try to, again, do the songs that I would recommend off of each album, but again, I run into the problem where these albums are really short, or some of them I only like one song from the album. But, yeah. But this is a really well done album. I mean, as far as a bunch of dudes in their garage uh, making these albums can do. Of course, they were performing all around in New Jersey and performing at local clubs and such, and gaining a lot more popularity that way. But they weren't as famous yet, not at least in 1982. The album's fine. It's a perfect example of what Misfits are with Danzig. I should mention that their lead singer does change 2 different times. 3 different singers, I guess, is technically how I would say that, to clarify that. So there's 3 eras. There's the Danzig era, which is what I would consider technically the best of the Misfits era, but there's also Michael Graves, who was surprisingly pretty okay, but we'll get more into him a little later. And then Jerry Only, who is technically the other member of the band who is the only constant, which is Jerry Only and Glenn Danzig. And technically Danzig is only a constant in the sense that he was around for so long and that he was so famous, but otherwise Glenn Danzig wasn't around after a certain point. But again, we'll all get to this later, and more history will be covered in the final thoughts because there's a lot to go through. But regardless, This album's fine. It's a perfect example of what I would explain the Misfits as. Songs that are just very chaotic and hectic, and lyrics that are a little messed up, but just grim and kind of dark, but just for the sake of being grim and dark, not necessarily because that's how they felt. It was just kind of like anger and erratic emotions just being screamed into a microphone while guitars and drums and bass are just being slammed on, and surprisingly it's all composed very well. Out of most of the punk bands that came around in the 70s, in the late 70s, early 80s, which was essentially the end of the punk kind of revolution, if you will, a lot of the bands, they can get kind of blended in together because they all kind of sound the same or don't really have a sound that really is distinctive enough. It's all just kind of slamming guitars and such. But with the Misfits, you can actually pick them out of a group, and maybe that's kind of what makes them famous. But regardless, really good album, one that I would listen to. There's a lot of, like I said, horror, B movie, kind of sci-fi references here and there, either in the titles of the songs or references in the lyrics, or even just throwing in some sounds and samples from those movies. But a good album. Let's move on. Many band member changes later and other things, again, Jerry Only and Glenn Danzig being the only ones staying a constant, came Earth AD, or, well, I guess that's technically the A side, and the B side is called Wolf's Blood. I thought maybe they had alternate covers, but they don't. So, and I will say for a little bit here, excuse some of the quality of these album photos. They're not amazingly. They're not great, and they're not easy to find either in high quality. So I try to bring as high quality as I can, even if it's just a scan of an album. But regardless, Earth AD, which is what I'll just be calling it since it does have two names, but Earth AD came out in 1983, a year later. Only 9 tracks and only 14 minutes long. That's, I think, the shortest album I've ever covered, period, and the shortest album from them, and as well as the least amount of tracks. And this marked the end of the Danzig era. This was the last album with Danzig in it. Regardless, there were 3 albums with him, and of course we've only covered 2, but I'll stop talking about that until we get there. But this was the last album with him in it, and you can kind of tell that there's some tension going on with the band through the music, which is weird, because it sort of takes a change in style from being hardcore punk to a little more like on the heavy metal side, and just a little more melodic in some ways, as opposed to where it was more chaotic in the past. But surprisingly, that's not a bad thing. It actually brings a new style to them in what I would consider would be 2 albums that, if they had the same style, would have just blended together very well. But surprisingly, because this album has changed in style like that, it actually becomes something totally different, and I actually really like this album. What isn't my favorite? No, I wouldn't say that, but it's a really good album. Again, considering my favorite era that comes from Misfits is with Danzig being the lead singer, because I do think he is the best, it's a pretty solid album. Again, most of the same stuff following, B-horror and B-sci-fi movie references in the names and titles or other things, but as well as some of the creative ideas that I actually do really like. And a couple of other songs thrown here or there that kind of throw you for a loop and change it up. Really good album. This one I definitely recommend listening to. Walk Among Us, I would say, is like a give or take. Listen to it if you're really, really interested. If not, you couldn't. It doesn't matter. But this one I would say really definitely check out, because it's worth it. But let's move on. American Psycho. So, let's talk a little bit about some history in between the 2 albums, because there has been some time. Or more than a decade, actually. But regardless, after 83, the band kind of broke up. Danzig was gone, he went to go form other things, and actually, during the production of Earth AD, he was making music for his other project called Samhain, which eventually just became Danzig. And some weird stuff kind of happened in between. Because of Danzig gaining more popularity at the time, he actually boosted the popularity of Misfits more than he really intended. Um, and as well, he had rights still to Misfits as a brand and as the music, and he kept re-releasing a lot of the albums in compilations or releasing other albums that hadn't been released at all. And little Collection 1, Collection 2, which are arguably their most famous stuff from them. Maybe not necessarily albums in particular, but those two collections are what people knew Misfits more for, as opposed to knowing them as the band that performed at CBGB in New York or New Jersey. I can't remember where it is, but regardless, in the time between, some legal battles happened between Misfits and Jerry Only, who was again the other member of the band who stood around, and essentially a lot of weird stuff happened in between, which led to ultimately Danzig released a lot of the music that was recorded with the old band members, but instead dubbed over it so that he didn't have to pay them the royalties. They didn't like that. Of course, who wouldn't? Who would like that? No one would. So, long court battle that eventually got settled in the sense where the band members, the band music, performing as the band, all went to Jerry Only, who was going to bring back the band, whereas merchandising was split between the two of them, meaning the Crimson Ghost face, which we're seeing right here, and as well as any other icons like the logo and the font for Misfits. But regardless, on to the music. Now, again, Danzig is gone, so no more Glenn Danzig as the lead singer. They had to hire someone else. They hire Michael Graves, who started off when he was 19 at the time, and he actually really got their style down. That was the most surprising thing about this album. So, let's get into the info of the album. It came out in 1997, almost an entire decade and a half later. That's 14 years in between. A total of 17 tracks and 39 minutes. Now, this is an album that feels a little more familiar with the albums of everything else. And Michael Graves is surprisingly really, really good. I thought I was going to have a hard time getting used to his voice, considering Danzig, I hold it such a high bar, high regard, I guess. And I thought it was going to be kind of hard to listen to someone new taking over the lead singing, but actually Michael Graves was really good and fine. He brings a new dynamic to the music that definitely makes it feel a little more fresh. Again, bringing them out of a sense of maybe feeling like they might be doing the same thing over again, because, again, there are more, the movie references from stuff in the 50s, horror and sci-fi stuff. A lot of references to that in just song name or in lyrics or whatever, but surprisingly, they changed the style again, leaning a little more again towards heavy metal, but still mixing in horror punk style. And with their lead singer changing it up, it all sounds really new and really fresh. And it's a really good album. All the way solid through. I'd argue that this would be my second favorite album of all of the albums, period. This one's definitely good to take a look at. If you're a fan of Danzig at all, and you might think that it's not like you won't be able to handle a new lead singer, I can tell you right now that it's actually pretty easy. He nails down the style of Danzig while also still being unique in his own way, and it all sounds fine, fitting again in with the horror punk style and fitting in with Misfits style, but like I keep repeating, bringing something new, and I really like that. And there's really nothing else to say, so let's move on to the next album, Static Age. And if you're looking at the album art, yeah, you see that? The Misfits. This is the first album. This is the first album that was recorded all the way back in 1978, but was only released until 1996 and 1997. And I'll explain that in a second. But, yeah, this is the first album that was recorded. And these are all tracks including Danzig, including Jerry Only, and including the original members of the band. And eventually it got released in a box set for the Misfits in 1996, along with other albums that they had made and EPs and such. But then the year later, in 1997, the same year that American Psycho came out, they released it as a full and solo album for people to buy and listen to. And this is my favorite album, of course. Danzig's lead singer. That's bar none already good. And for being early Misfits, it's really different. But at the same time, familiar. They bring that style of punk that they have in the beginning, before even Walk Among Us, but at the same time, they're not sticking to hardcore punk style. They're not just, like I said, slamming their instruments and hoping notes come out and screaming into the microphone all that often. In fact, most of the songs have them singing in a collaborative effort, or in some way the instrumentals are complementing the vocals, or the instrumentals are complementing other instrumentals, and it's really good. The lyrics are all really great and very clear to hear, and this is the album where the most memorable songs will come from. We Are 138 and Last Caress are probably their biggest songs that anyone can know off the top of their head, and where they come from is here, when they were known as the Misfits, not Misfits. And there's really nothing else I can say. It's 17 tracks in 35 minutes. Again, something totally different. A really long album where early Misfits, like I said, the first technical two albums, show that they want to be quick, they want to have very little tracks, and they want to have very little time taken up. They want them to be over really quick, whereas with this album, they want to take their time, put out as many songs as they can, and have it lengthen out and take, as much time as it needs. And this arguably might be because of some mastering done by Jerry Only or Danzig or whoever, but regardless, it's a really good album. It's solid. Okay, there's some things that I know I've kind of neglected to talk about because I do want to sum it all up in the last part of the video, but these are the Misfits. This is what they looked like. This is Famous Monsters, the first album to really show what they look like and what they wear on stage, which is this crazy makeup and their hair looking insane. And that's part of the charm of Misfits, is this weird horror kind of look that definitely would have fit in with a movie from the 60s and the 50s, but nowadays just looks bizarre. But at the same time, it fits with the style and the things they evoke. And so does this album, which came out in 1999, a total of 18 tracks, which is their most amount of tracks, and only 44 minutes long. But regardless, this is a really good album. Again, Michael Graves bringing vocals that sound even more different than he did on American Psycho, straying away from being a little too familiar with Glenn Danzig's style of singing, and instead bringing more of his own style and being a little more unique, which I definitely like. And that's, again, a thing that I like about Misfits, is that between each of the albums, there's always something different, something coming new to the next album. Even if it takes a while in between some of the albums, because of whatever reasons, there's always a different change in style that always still fits and feels familiar with something older. So, if you're a fan of something that comes from some of the early stuff, coming into the newer stuff, you still feel like you know who they are, and you still feel like, yeah, that's Misfits. That's what I remember hearing. And that's definitely what this album feels like. Granted, I'll give them... This is where that style of the referencing the movies kind of thing becomes a little old. And sure, it's not really anything to notice all that much when you consider kind of how the song titles only play so little in the actual songs, but in particular they just bring out good songs. I guess it's like when the songs are listened to, they're very solid songs, whereas the names have very little to do with the songs altogether, and they don't really change the style all that much. But regardless, they still feel like, we get it. You guys are referencing those movies, and that's great, but can we move on? And there are some songs here and there sprinkled out that definitely change the style a little bit, and bring a little more creative ideas towards song titles and towards lyrics that definitely feel like their own. But overall, a really good album. Not that bad. Okay, so this is The Devil's Ring. Now, Michael Graves left at some point between Famous Monsters and here. And by some point, I mean sometime in the 11 years it took for this album to come out. In about 2000, 2001-ish, Michael Graves left as a lead singer because he wanted to do something else, and he did. Him and another member of the band. Again, so many members of the band leave. It's not on. It's honestly not funny how many members they went through. That started their own bands and such. But regardless, Jerry Only, the bassist of the band, all the way up until this point, decided that whatever. I guess I'm just going to be the lead singer now, and he takes up lead singing duties, and it's not good. I just gonna not. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it or sprinkle it. It's just not good. Jerry Only sort of has a voice, I guess, a singing voice, but it doesn't fit at all. Yeah, there's something really weird about his vocals that feels so foreign to Misfits. Especially considering there was a time in between 1983 and 1995 ish where Jerry Only made a Christian metal band. And I'm not saying that that imparts anything on this album, but as far as singing, I don't. It's not good. The lyrics are fine. They're nothing memorable though. This whole album feels like that. Nothing memorable. It came out in 2011. It has 16 tracks, but it's 50 minutes long. That's their longest album, period, and that's too long. Um, it does not feel good at all. When I looked at the amount of songs from each of the albums that I saved as like or whatever songs that I remember from the albums that I would continue to listen to, this one had one, and that was it. Every other album had like at least minimum 3 or 4, but most of them went over that limit. Whereas here, there was only one song that I liked, and even that song, when I listened to it again, was okay. It wasn't amazing. It wasn't really Misfits. Sure, the guitar is there, but it's slower, and it's heavy metal, but it's like melodic heavy metal. Um, the vocals are slower. The lyrics are toned down and not as crazy as they should be. It almost feels like maybe at some point they should have just stopped when they realized that they didn't have a lead singer that people would connect with. And I'm not saying that Jerry Only's not a or that Jerry Only is a bad band member, but as far as lead singing, those duties shouldn't be left to him. As a bassist, that's fine, and as other instrumentals on the rest of the albums, it's fine. But when you have to look at your band and realize there's no lead singer and decide I'm just gonna take that up as my responsibility, don't do that. Don't do that at all. That's a bad thing. That's bad. There's you get put in a spot because you're good there, and I'm not saying that you can't be good anywhere else, but don't do it. Don't do it. It don't feel good. It doesn't sound good. Don't do it. So let's get into the history of the Misfits. Now, we listed off a lot of stuff in the beginning there, like, how they got their name, things like that. But let's move into where they started, all the way back in 1977. So they formed in 1977. They had a little bit of success, made a couple songs and such. Again, the album Static Age came out, or rather was recorded, didn't come out yet. But they had been releasing singles and EPs and other things to people who were fans or people who wanted to buy them. They started touring for, I don't remember which EP specifically, but it was in 1978 where then they started touring. And then their first guitarist quit. And then so did their drummer. The guitarist, he didn't really like touring. He didn't feel like he could do it. And the drummer just didn't like the style they were going for, which was when they started going for their horror style. Painting their face and being shirtless and such, and doing the crazy hair spike. I can't remember what it's called. It's the devil's something, but whatever. Again, some time passes through where they're making more songs, releasing them to the public, and then eventually they get invited, in heavy quotes, to go to London to tour with another band. But what ends up happening is that the band that they were supposed to tour with didn't take it seriously and didn't think that they were actually going to come. And when they did, he went, "Oh, good," and he kind of messed up. So, being stranded in London for a while until their, plane goes back, the new drummer left again. Again, this is going to be a lot of band member leaving. And a lot of other weird things happen in London that eventually leads to a song called London Dungeon. There's some story about them getting into some weird things, doing some weird things, talking with people that were famous at the time. Just some weird stuff. Finally, they release a new EP in 1980, and then they decide they're going to take a 4-month break because they have no drummer. And then finally, they find a new drummer and they add him. Some more time passes, and one of the members, his younger brother, is learning guitar. The meanwhile, while the Misfits are performing and touring and doing whatever, going to different shows, and eventually, this younger brother convinces Danzig, along with his older brother who's already in the band, to kick out their guitarist to replace them with him. And then they used him for the recordings of their first studio album and their subsequent albums afterwards. And that guitarist that got kicked out went on to form The Undead, which is still really famous punk band that actually still makes albums to this day and still performs, which is pretty crazy. Again, more success following after the first album, more popularity, more shows. But then they realized that the shows are getting a little more violent and chaotic, and it's kind of getting hard for them to handle their shows. Eventually, some fight starts happening between the drummer at the time and Danzig, which eventually leads to them fighting in a McDonald's, full on, arguing and yelling and such, and Danzig kicks him out, and there he goes, bye, another drummer gone. So, Henry Rollins, if you don't know, lead singer of Black Flag, is a good friend with Glenn Danzig at the time, and he says to them, "Hey, we just got rid of our drummer, why don't you hire him for your band?" And he becomes the new drummer. So, again, now, 1982, bunch of tours. Eventually, they lead into New Orleans, where they get arrested, all of them, for grave robbing, trying to find the voodoo practitioner, Marie Laveau. She's pretty famous if you study stuff like that, the occult and such. They bailed themselves out, and before they can go to court, they had to leave for the next show in Florida. So, there's that. After a while, again, now 1983, Danzig didn't want to really be a part of Misfits anymore, and he was planning to leave. And he was telling a lot of this stuff to Henry Rollins, again, lead singer of Black Flag. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where Danzig was making songs for his new project and mixing them and such. And after they recorded their second album, Misfits, he left. Yeah. So, in the time between, band performs at their annual Halloween show. New drummers added to, help because the last drummer got kicked out again. So many drummers. But as they're about to perform the show, that drummer is so drunk he can't perform. Luckily, one of the bands who was performing at the time at the same show decided to let their drummer fill in for him. At the end of the show, though, Danzig grabs a mic and says that this was their last show ever. And 2 months before the release of their album, their next studio album, they left. And they split apart. Now, again, this is that time between where Danzig was releasing a lot of stuff, and he was making his own band, of course, Sam Hain, which then became Danzig. releasing a lot of stuff under the name Misfits. Then the legal battle happens. Jerry only winning some part and Danzig winning some other part. Then, after Jerry only finally gets the rights, which is in 1995, he immediately starts, bringing members back, one specific member back, and bringing two other members in. And they decided we're going to start recording again. And their new lineup made their technical first appearance on this really weird movie called Animal Room. I've never seen it. I just know what it has Neil Patrick Harris and Matthew Lillard. It's completely random, but hey, first appearance. And I will say that for some reason, Jerry Only and a lot of the other band members have this weird thing to constantly be a part of other movies following after this, which was, I think, 1995, 96. And they're in a lot of really random and weird things if you want to look that up yourself. I'm not going to go through it all because they're just so completely obscure. That might be handled by someone better than me, but regardless. Finally, then, Static Age is released. The box collection has it in 1996 and then released as a studio album in 1997. Again, a lot of really good success and for Misfits as a whole in between their next album. And it actually brings a lot more success to the Danzig era stuff, which leads them to do some tribute albums to a lot of the songs that were made back then and re-recorded in some new way. Now, 1998, finally, they got their new lead singer, they release a new album, he's doing tours for a little while, he takes a bit of a break, but nothing too long, he comes back for the new album. And then in 2000, in the year 2000, the band starts having more and more tension, and Michael Graves leaves, and then the newest, there's so many drummers leaves mid-show during a show at the House of Blues, and then Michael Graves and this drummer make a single album together. It's so random. Then this is where Jerry Only takes over for vocals and bass at the same time. He was already a bassist for since the beginning of Misfits, and then he takes over vocals. Again, not a good thing. Was not a good thing. And then Black Flag, again, having their guitarist quit, he decided he was going to join them and then quit again. A bunch of drummer changes between here from 2000 to about 2006-ish, I would say. The drummer from the Ramones was in for a while, filling in for their tours and stuff. It was just a lot of weird stuff at the time. A lot of weird album releases, but there's nothing really consistent about this time. It's just some weird touring stuff. On the other side of things, Danzig and Doyle, who was the original guitarist, the one that replaced the original, I guess. So Danzig and Doyle, who's a guitarist, decide that while Danzig is performing live, Doyle will come out and they will perform Misfit songs. And they're really well perceived by the audience, and they're surprising and such. And they do it for so long, for 2006, 2007, 2008, all these tours in between then. Finally, in 2016, which is pretty recent, they announced that after 30 years or so of the Misfits being split, it's finally a reunion. It seemed like it wasn't ever going to happen because Danzig was saying some weird things, as he always does, and Jerry Only was mostly staying quiet, saying some things of how he would have liked it, though. And then it happened, yeah. Pretty much ever since then, that's the end. They've been performing together, Jerry Only, Glenn Danzig, and Doyle, the original members of the band, performing Misfit songs live. They had a couple of shows in early 2016 at Riot Fest for here in Chicago and I believe in Denver. And they were performing and a lot of people really liked it, and of course, who wouldn't? And then again, in very recent, just a couple months ago, they had some shows in Las Vegas, which a lot of people were really excited for. And that's really the end of the Misfits, or Misfits. Yeah, just a long, extensive history of band member changes and other crazy, stupid things, but in the end, eventually leading to them coming back. And in some ways, maybe it was a good thing that they split up because, of course, it seemed like maybe they weren't doing so hot. But in other ways, some people might consider that a bad thing and that maybe they should have split up, or should have stayed split. But I think it's a good thing and it brings new opportunities. They've been talking a long time about making a new album with Danzig as the lead singer, Doyle as the guitarist, and Jerry Only as the bassist, and it's really only due time and hope that that album will ever happen, but it's just a lot of weird things between the band members still, of course. They're all a bunch of old farts just getting mad at each other still every once in a while, but what are you gonna do? If that album ever comes out, I'd gladly cover it somewhere else here on the channel, but if that never happens, then hey, you know what? At least we had some hope or something. But regardless, that's the end of my Misfits album, their studio album covering, and that's the end of Punk Month, which is every May now I'm going to make that. Yeah, every May is going to be Punk Month, where I just cover punk bands that I want to talk about. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like the video, give it a thumbs down. If you got any critiques you want to tell me, leave them in the comments down below. If you got any, artist group or bands you want me to listen to, you can go ahead and leave that down in the comments down below, because I sure would love to hear what you would like me to hear.